Very embarrassed to admit that despite spending 2 years in a Hebrew nursery school in South Africa, that's the only word I remember. So hopefully I'll pick up a few more while I'm here. Thanks to Salita and your team for this great opportunity to participate in this workshop and to make my first trip to Israel. I've just realized two things: that I'm the only person standing between you and lunch, and that I'm the 7th version of English that you're hearing this morning. So I'm going to try and keep this short and sweet and get to the point. So when Salita asked me to please spend 20 minutes reflecting on the South African experience of conservation science and conservation practice, it took me a little while to sift through all the amazing experiences, the successes and failures in the country to come up with something that would be useful to an audience like this. And so I'm going to be presenting some of these experiences. But they're very few. I mean, that's obviously a huge field. So I thought it's useful to start off with a brief history of South African conservation. Fortunately, post-colonial history in South Africa is a lot shorter than post-colonial history in Israel. So this shouldn't take too long. Basically, the first colonial people arrived in South Africa in the 1600s, but began to move into the interior of the country in the 1700s, where they discovered this bountiful wealth of wildlife, edible wildlife, and sellable wildlife, and they went on a mad hunting craze, and it's estimated that about 20 million head of game were exterminated in the next 100 years. Many species went extinct, the blowbook and the quagga were some examples, and the sort of rather large-scale slaughter of species like elephant for ivory and large game safaris was quite phenomenal during this period, and there's some really interesting evidence of the impacts. So about 100 years after the beginning of this extermination of wildlife, a visionary man, Paul Kruger, actually decided that it might be time to start doing something about it because they were running out of things to kill. And so they set up the first game reserve in South Africa called the Pongola Game Reserve, and actually it was called the Pongola Gameless Game Reserve because there weren't any animals in it at that stage. But the idea behind it was to sort of act as a reservoir for species to recover so that they could be shot again. This area expanded in the next couple of decades and was actually the starting area of the Kruger National Park, which many of you may be familiar with. And then the next century saw an amazing growth of conservation in the country. This is just the area under state-owned protected areas, which is up to about 7% recently and will be at 8% hopefully by the end of this year. It's important to remember that as with all sectors in South Africa, the century of conservation, the last century of conservation, has been a very segregated century, and conservation, just like every other sector, was separated based on race, and these protected areas were really for the use of white people, set up by white people for the benefit of white people, and very often to the detriment of indigenous people in the country. And so in an interesting paper, Rachel Weinberg actually looks at the last 2 decades of conservation in South Africa, spanning the process of the change from apartheid to democracy, showing this amazing shift from a very sort of elitist, privileged, protectionist form of conservation in the early 1900s to the current focus on civil society and equity and sustainability within protected areas. She also highlights the amazing developments that went on within the science of conservation in the early 1900s, and we still benefit from the legacy of the investment in wildlife management science and rangeland management and all sorts of scientific capacity that was built in the country. So what I'm going to focus on now are the sort of more recent developments in conservation, and I call them the evolution of the conservation toolbox, for want of a better term. And they're basically 4 phases that we've seen in the country. They started off with the moral suasion phase, which is really the sort of beg, cry, borrow approach of trying to convince people to do conservation because they must, through to a much more focused approach on legislation, a more integrated approach which I'll discuss in more detail, and to later approaches which tap into values. So my opinion is that the role of science has actually increased in conservation as we've gone into the later phases of development of conservation, and I'll give you some examples as I go through these cases. I'm not going to say much about moral suasion. There's not a whole heap of biological science that goes into this. It's quite a social science area of investigation, how you convince people to do things that they don't want to do. And we're quite good at it in South Africa. The legislation is quite an exciting development. In 1994, as South Africa became a democracy, almost every sector in the country was allowed to redefine itself, redevelop itself, and redefine its legislation and laws as well. And the biodiversity community didn't miss out on this opportunity and actually developed the first Biodiversity Act for the country. This is a fundamentally important piece of legislation that deals with everything from species through to ecosystems and protected areas. It also led to the establishment of South Africa's National Biodiversity Institute, which is an amazing organization in that it brings together scientists and managers, which is quite rare in South Africa because scientists usually work at universities and managers usually work for government, and the two don't often meet. And it also set up the Environmental Management Inspectorate, which we call the Green Scorpions. And this is sort of a police task force that's tasked with looking after poaching and similar sorts of illegal activities. So SANBI, as I said, is this really amazing organization. They're very focused on bringing people together to do the kind of flirtations that Hugh spoke about, providing opportunities for scientists, managers, practitioners at all levels of government to actually interact with each other. This is an example of their biodiversity planning forum, which brings together conservation planners and then implementers of those plans. These are just the last 3 years of photographs of this growing forum that meets once a year, and just an indication of the makeup of that forum, that there are quite a few universities involved, but also a lot of provincial conservation agencies and local conservation agencies and environmental managers too. Right, so I wanted to spend more time on the two more recent developments. I mean, the legislation's been really important, and scientists were quite involved in developing some of that legislation and developing some of the guidelines attached to that legislation, but it wasn't necessarily a science process. The next one I want to talk about is the move to integrate conservation more broadly into society in South Africa. And in order to explain this and the next developments, I'm going to use this hierarchy which Manfred Max Neef developed just to kind of try and depict what I'm talking about. So basically the way society is structured is that it's divided into these sectors. You've got conservation and water management, tourism, and all the way through to industrial and development management. And society is broken up into these sectors who develop their laws and their policies and their visions and their goals and their targets, and people, scientists and managers and policymakers work in these sectors. Most of the people who work in these sectors come from a range of different disciplines. So, you know, the life sciences and the earth sciences are generally where most of us come from, and working in the conservation or environmental sectors. Then there's engineering sciences and social sciences. And so the people who work in these sectors come from specific disciplinary backgrounds, speak a particular language, and even have particular worldviews. And it's made us realize that the divisions, therefore, between these sectors are a lot harder and a lot bigger than we actually originally thought. So conservation people usually talk to conservation people and not much to other people in other sectors. These sectors, in turn, work to influence national laws, planning and policy by contributing to those processes. And that's usually how we see the implementation of the work and the science that goes on within those sectors. And it's important to remember that there's this top level to this hierarchy which we call national values. And those are basically the values that determine whether laws get passed or not. We've heard a lot of discussion of values in the social landscape. And so I'll give you an example. In South Africa, while the Constitution is very focused on environmental issues and environmental equity, it's also very focused on social equity. And in general, one finds that social and economic development take precedence over environmental management issues at this value level. And government's much more interested in job creation, in economic growth, than they are in environmental sustainability. And so you find that these different sectors actually have have very varying levels of impact on the national planning and policy environment because of how different the values are and the languages are that we speak. So this is the case in South Africa, where if you work in the industrial sector or the development sector, government loves you. You're at all their meetings, you're invited to all their forums, your policies are their policies. The map that Eric showed us of the road networks and the human influence, our government loves those maps because they show progress and they show development and they show improvements in socioeconomic measures. So if you come from the conservation sector, government's not too interested. Every now and then they'll bring you in because they need a bit of greenwashing on a particular policy document, but you're not really their favourite child. So what the conservation sector has done, some very wise people have realised, well then let's go and piggyback on some of these more relevant sectors, mainstream our work into those sectors and hopefully tap into the values that they have. And we've done that quite successfully with water, with agriculture and with tourism. I'll give you an example from the water sector. This is a South African landscape. It shouldn't look like this at all. It's usually a sort of a fynbos or a Mediterranean looking piece of landscape, and this is actually all invaded by Australian acacias and European pines. And this has had a detrimental effect on biodiversity in these regions, massive declines in species that don't like trees. But nobody really cares about that. What they care about is that these plants use 7% of the water available in these landscapes. And so some very clever conservation scientists and water scientists got together with government and established the Working for Water program, which some of you may have heard of. It's an amazing program that uses government funding to hire unemployed people to clear alien trees for the water benefits, and luckily we get some biodiversity benefits on the side. And they've grown to now include a program on working for wetlands, which is about restoring wetlands for similar reasons around water quality issues. And there's now a new one called Working for Woodlands, which looks at restoring habitats to capture carbon payments too. Scientists have been very crucial in this process in actually delivering the science on how much water these species actually use. Here's an example of water use projections by alien plant species in various biomes across the country. We've done the same with impacts on grazing and impacts on carbon and impacts on fire regimes too. And the program is amazingly successful. This is just an example of some of the government investment. So South African rand, double it and you get the values in shekels. So that's an enormous investment in a conservation program in South Africa, and also one gets an idea of the area being cleared of alien plants and how that's actually growing. And for a government program to remain invested in an effort like this over 10 years and to actually grow that investment is quite unique. So I think this has been a successful example of piggybacking or maybe mainstreaming into another sector, and science was pretty critical in this development. But these are the easy sectors. These are our friends. We understand water and we understand tourism. Getting into the other sectors is really perhaps where the greatest pot of gold lies at the end of the rainbow, because these are the sectors that government basically asks to make their decisions for them. And here the field of conservation planning has been one useful example. There are other really great examples, but I'll just show this one. So many of you are familiar with this idea that one can do these spatial planning exercises to actually identify priorities for conservation. South Africa loves conservation plans. This is just an idea of all the broad-scale conservation plans we have in the country, and these are some of the fine-scale local municipal plans that we have. And I forgot to include the fact that the entire exclusive economic zone in the marine environment has been planned, as well as our offshore islands near the subantarctic. So we have a lot of conservation planning, lots of papers, lots of students, lots of people working in it. And some very clever people realized that the development sector works in a very similar spatial way. They have to do what's called a spatial development framework for each of the administrative units. So here's one for the city of Cape Town, which is near where I live. And they do everything very spatially: transport nodes, infrastructure hubs, open spaces, etc., etc. And if you look at what the conservation plan looks like, it looks like they're almost talking the same language. So some clever people at Sandy actually came up with some guidelines for conservation planners to say, here's how you should do your conservation plan, these are the words you should use, these are the terminologies that are acceptable within the spatial development framework. And what's happening, because our plans are being done in this very easy to understand way, we're actually, and here's some guidelines about how to do it and some examples, we're actually seeing the new generation of these spatial development plans in South Africa have the conservation plans as one of their basic layers, and they're using words like resilience and natural resources in an area where you never used to hear those words, where nature was a swear word. And that hasn't been too much work, but it was this idea of just actually recognizing what other work was going on in these sectors and how similar our work was. So then getting on to the last recent set of developments in conservation is this idea of relevance. So I explained before that conservation is really seen as pretty irrelevant in the country. It's not that we're not all proud of our natural resources and our natural heritage, but really when it comes to doing a trade-off of, you know, one bird species for 22,000 jobs, it's a bit of a hard trade-off to do. But I actually think we're beginning to convince government and decision makers that conservation may actually be much more relevant to these national values of economic and social, especially social development goals that the country has. And we're doing this mostly through tools that are around valuation. And I don't mean economic valuation here. I'm really talking about the value of conservation. We very seldom do that. We start from a base point where we assume that people appreciate that we need to do conservation, but here we're actually providing some of the justification and the values attached to it. And we're using the concept of ecosystem services a lot in South Africa. The idea that ecosystems and biodiversity provides benefits to people, ranging from food all the way to recreation and religious values, has been something that our government has really liked, and our Department of Environment has been quite excited by. They're renaming the Natural Heritage Division the Ecosystem Services Division. So it seems to be a language, well, ecosystem services themselves as a word isn't a particularly useful language, but talking about benefits and values. And Tom showed some of these slides earlier, the idea that keeping an ecosystem in a natural state as opposed to converting into another state can actually make much better economic sense in the long term. So making these things a little bit more explicit has been quite useful. I'm going to show 3 very brief projects that have used this concept and how it's worked in the country. One is the idea around markets, very loosely defined. One is the idea about making trade-offs explicit, and the other idea is this task of developing a common language to speak to decision makers. So the idea of markets is that a lot of things that we get from nature often we don't have to pay for, and often we get paid to use them in ways that are not sustainable. Water is a fantastic example. For most of the 1900s, farmers were actually paid by government to divert water, build dams and weirs, and channel every bit of water that they can find, and as a result, about 95% of the water in South Africa's catchments is allocated to a particular use, and about 60% of that is for irrigated agriculture. Recently, we've seen the development of this idea of water resource management charges. There's been a lot of conflict around that, telling farmers that they actually have to pay for water, and the management of water hasn't been a very peaceful process. But assigning a value to water has really changed the way land is used in the country, and we're actually seeing a lot of agricultural land falling back into its natural conditions because it can no longer be used in an affordable way. And this has happened also within the forestry sector. The amount of timber plantations in the country is declining because forestry now has to pay for the water that those forests actually use. We're also seeing some evolution of new markets. Carbon is one everyone talks about. We don't have any tropical forests to speak of, but some really interesting research that looks at the losses of carbon. This is a wonderful fence line contrast in the thicket areas of South Africa, where you've got heavy goat grazing on the left and very little well-managed grazing on the right. And we're seeing amazing carbon losses, specifically soil carbon losses. And this has led to a government-funded project to actually look at the costs and benefits of building a carbon market around compensating those farmers for not grazing and paying these farmers to stop grazing over a 20-year period. So we're seeing some really useful markets coming in to conservation, even though we don't have the Amazon in our country. The next one I wanted to talk about was this idea of trade-offs, and quite a few of the speakers today have mentioned this issue that, you know, one needs to make decision makers aware of the trade-offs associated with any particular decision. And ecosystem services are a really nice way to do this. This is just an example, a hypothetical example of what the kind of ecosystem services could be that you get from a pristine or a natural ecosystem, and the one that you could get from a more intensive use of a particular ecosystem service. And, you know, highlighting what you're losing in order to gain some more of that service, I think has had a role to play. We've seen it in a moratorium on golf courses in South Africa. I think South Africa has more golf courses than it has golfers. I'm not sure what the obsession is, but a lot of these golf courses are built in really sensitive coastal habitat, use a lot of water and actually prevent access to coastal resources, which has always been something that the coast is a public zone and anyone's allowed to go in, and communities get permitting harvests to go and collect mussels and various food and medicinal products from these areas. And so by actually highlighting to government the trade-offs around these golf courses, the water losses, the resource access issues, using this concept of ecosystem services helped to kind of counterbalance the argument that the golf course developers were using about numbers of job and economic benefits from these areas. And so we had a moratorium for a while on these. And the final thing that I think ecosystem services have been really useful for, whatever the term is that you want to use, is this idea of developing a common language. And last year the presidency actually approached a group of conservation and ecology scientists in the country to work on this project for them, on looking at, can ecosystem service markets be a solution to some of the poverty challenges in the country? Can we look at setting up some communal payments for ecosystem service schemes? And they were very interested in some of the science between ecosystem service mapping and modelling and some of the maps and models that they already have of poverty. So it's not very complex science, this doesn't really even need you to have a PhD, but it's allowing a dialogue between two groups of people who've never usually been able to talk to each other because they think that they come from opposing camps. So I think in this line it's been quite exciting that the presidency, who've never really been interested in the environment, are actually asking us to investigate the role that better conservation markets could play in some of these areas. So, in conclusion, basically, I think it's been a useful exploration. I mean, it sounds like we did this in a very strategic and planned way, but we didn't. It's only when you sit there 10 years later and you say, how does this all fit together, and you find somebody else's framework that you can start to explain how it might work. But it's been really useful, I think, this idea of mainstreaming into other sectors, understanding how other sectors are perhaps more effective than we are, has been really very critical. And this idea of understanding the way governments make decisions and what it is that they value and how you can influence that or how you can tap into that has also been a very profitable area to explore. Not everything has worked as nicely as the examples that I've shown you here, but I'll do that in my next presentation. And I'd just like to end by thanking all the people who are part of these projects and this work. This is just a small example of some of them. Thanks very much.